Well, hello everyone. It is about 6 o'clock. I'm leaving work. Yay. I'm freaking exhausted. It's kind of a day today. It was really busy for Tuesday. Anyhow, I didn't get that quite right, did I? There we go. I'm never quite satisfied with, I don't know, the way that looks. I don't know, I'll figure it out. One day I'll get one of those windshield mounted things, but for that you need money and I just don't have it. Alright, so what was I going to talk about today? I wanted to talk about something today, and I don't know, this is a little tricky because I've kind of been wanting to talk about the subject for a while, but I don't want to get all political, you know, and this is more legal than political, but it is political, and it has, you know, political implications. So, you know, I mean, you guys have listened to me rant on and on about school and education and all the kind of places I went wrong and all the places I think our society's going wrong, but there's one really sort of key element that I think I may have touched on it, but I haven't really discussed it at great length, at least that I can recall. I wonder if I did. I don't think I did, though, but in any event, I wanted to talk about this. If I have talked about this before, I apologize, because I know I probably reiterate the same points sometimes. I want to talk about compulsory education, the institution of compulsory education. It's a really interesting sort of thing to me because it's kind of been around in one form or another sort of basically forever. You know, you really can go back to the colonial period, and there were sort of rudimentary compulsory education laws in place in certain of the colonies. But nobody ever took compulsory education that seriously or thought, you know, it wasn't really a thing. It wasn't really a major part of life until the Depression. And one of the reasons that happened was you had a situation where before, like in the 20s, in the turn of the century up through the 20s, dropping out of school was actually pretty common, either because of, you know, you had to go to work or you just frankly weren't good enough. I mean, getting a high school diploma back then really was tough. It was not an easy thing to do, and it was a thing most people could not do. And so they just, you know, they washed out or they dropped out. And it's just fairly common. I mean, if you had a high school diploma, that really meant something. And so needless to say, there really were a lot of jobs available for people who had diplomas versus people that didn't. I mean, it really meant something. It was like, oh wow, you have a high school diploma. Well, all right then. So, in the 1930s, though, when the Depression kind of hit, and you had a problem of, a lot of people sort of went back to school anyway because it's like, well, what the hell else am I going to do? You know, I'm out of work. Might as well see if I can get back into school. But the few jobs that were available, you know, even the real scut work jobs that kids used to do, they needed to keep those jobs open for adults. Because you had this kind of really frightening situation where it's kind of being parallel today in some ways, in that like the jobs that kids used to do now, like that, those were the jobs available, and there weren't very many of those. So, you know, it was like, you know, you had 30 and 40-year-old men doing jobs that used to be done by 14-year-olds. And so they just kind of went, all right, you know. And the other piece of that was trying to get rid of some of the abuses that were happening of kids in, you know, in the labor, particularly in you know, like on assembly lines and stuff. You know, it wasn't that uncommon to have these 12-year-old kids working these like horrible 12-hour shifts and stuff, and they couldn't do anything about it because those guys had a lot of power. So anyway, you know, culmination of all of those things, they finally managed to pass. It kind of happened state by state. Compulsory education is largely in the purview of the states. The federal government has little or nothing to do with it. And so yeah, but particularly, you know, in states where abuses were real bad or they needed these jobs for adults, you know, they'd pass these compulsory education laws, get kids back in school. That resulted in both a lowering of standards in the high schools and an overcrowding problem that has never been resolved even to this day. Like, I mean, you think about the Depression as this thing that happened nearly a century ago, and you go, you know, 90 years ago, it has nothing to do with my life today. Well, this overcrowding thing in the high schools, like, it never went away. It just kind of started and never went away. And the reason I'm kind of giving you all this big, long shebang about this is because one of the points I think that I have made in the past that people sort of resist is that compulsory education is no longer necessary. Okay, the road is doing something strange up here. I'm not sure what, but I guess we'll find out. But yeah, compulsory education is not a thing that is in any way, shape, or form necessary. Given some of the history of it, there may have been a time when yeah, we needed compulsory education to kind of, to keep those jobs open for the people that needed them, for the adults or whatever. But that's no longer the case. We don't need that anymore. And sorry, I'm kind of just focusing on what is happening with traffic here a little bit. But the other problem that I have with compulsory education is kind of what it's, and it's not, there's sort of an indirect connection between the law and our culture, right? I mean, obviously, the laws change as culture changes, and as laws change, so can the culture. Somewhere along the line, and I think this kind of happened, I don't know, in the 50s and 60s, somewhere along the line, people decided that school was important, and education, as such, isn't. And that's a real big problem for me. Because for me, it's sort of the other way around. Education is important, and school isn't. School is important only insofar as it is conducive to education. And all compulsory education can do, what it tries to do, is create this framework for you to pursue an education within, but you have to stay within that framework. And that framework can be fairly broad, as it is in Utah, or fairly narrow, as it is in some other states. But no matter how broad it is, what you wind up doing is eliminating certain options, creating a situation where it's more difficult for certain children to pursue an education than certain other children. And that's all it can ever do. It can't ever, there is no useful thing, at least anymore. Again, maybe during the Depression there was a reason for it, and even then I really do question it, but whether they really needed to go about it that way. But at present, all it can do is prevent people from pursuing an education. And worse than that, in my mind, it's created this kind of weird cultural phenomenon, because I grew up kind of around people who said, look, we're adults, you're a kid, and you're going to do what we say, and that's the end of it, And the problem with that is, people drop out of school because they don't know that they have a choice. They don't know. If you talk to high school dropouts almost overwhelmingly, and I'm in this category, they'll say, why didn't somebody tell us? Why didn't somebody tell us what we were doing there? And one of the things that compulsory education is custom built to do is make sure no parent, no teacher ever has to explain what you're doing there. If you try to leave, if you're not learning, and you try to solve that problem, we'll just send a guy with a gun and a taser and a nightstick to make sure that you don't get to solve that problem. It creates the situation where adults don't have to be adults. They don't have to be accountable for their actions. And that's a real problem for me. That, to me, is part of one of the things that was happening when I was in school. That's part of the sort of, for want of a better term, the sort of anti-education culture that we've managed to create. People don't have to sit down with their kids and tell them, here's what you could do differently. People don't have to investigate alternatives, and they should have to. The law should err on the side of protecting children, not parents, and not teachers, and certainly not corporations. And there's just no reason. I mean, compulsory education exists for the benefit of parents, teachers, and corporations, not of students. And there's no justification for it when you look at the benefit of students. There's no way in which compulsory education does or even can benefit students. And the purpose of school should be to benefit, again, students. And I've made the case just constitutionally that I don't see how it's legal. Even the sort of really liberal, really loosey-goosey compulsory education laws we have in Utah, the minute a kid says, I'm not learning, you're violating that kid's constitutional rights by forcing him to continue to be in school. Whether you're a parent or the state or whoever, you can't do that to somebody. You cannot deprive somebody of an education. That, in my mind, is involuntary servitude, and that's unconstitutional. 13th Amendment. I think you'd probably have a really hard time getting a court to rule that way, but I mean, that's what I think. And I know that's really controversial. I know people sort of hear that and gasp in horror and say, oh, but what are the kids going to do instead, and all this stuff. And it's like, there is no instead. My contention is that kids would be in school more, and graduation rates are actually pretty good. They're as good or better than they've ever been, contrary to what a lot of people would have you believe. But somehow this situation has to be created where we're willing to talk to kids about why school is important and what you can do there, and if you can't do it there, where else can you do it? That's the conversation we should be having. And compulsory education seems almost custom designed to ensure that we don't ever have to have that conversation. Sure, you can. Nobody's stopping any parent or any teacher or any guidance counselor who wants to have that conversation. Nobody's stopping them. But you don't have to. If you choose not to have that conversation, if you choose to tell your kids, hey, we're adults, you're gonna do what we say, and that's the end of it. And we don't care whether you learn. We don't care. The consequences of our actions are on you. We don't care about whether you're learning or whether you're getting anything out of it. You've created a situation, potentially, where that kid cannot learn and grow. You've shut that kid off from the outside world. And, even as parents, it's kind of like, if you're a parent, I don't think you have the right to do that, but if you're going to do it, do it. I don't see how we can stop you. But society shouldn't aid that. Society should not help parents who are going to do that to their kids. The purpose of school, again, has to be the education of students. And when a kid says, I'm not learning, or when a kid is miserable and depressed and suicidal, these are things that need to be taken seriously. And again, compulsory education seems designed, custom built to ensure that it won't be taken seriously. I think the only reason it's started to be taken seriously, at least in Utah, is because of our really liberal compulsory education laws, because it is so easy to leave school. So that's kind of the thought I'm going to leave you with. And I wish that somehow we could start like a real dialogue on this. I feel like this just gets controversial and people get pissed off over it, and you never get anywhere. But anyway, I'm home now, so that's going to be my final word on the subject. But you guys fight it out in the comments if you want to. Anybody who wants to. All 5 of you. 5 is probably optimistic at this point, but whatever. And I will see you guys again tomorrow.